do you think Dick Clark made all his money? Initially, where do you think he made it? From guys like me. Granted, I cannot say anything derogatory. I can't say anything bad because I owe my success in the record phase of it to Dick Clark. Had he not put that show, and you want an inside story? Harry Rosen was my distributor. Harry Rosen comes to me and he said, Artie, he said, you're not going to believe this. Dick won't play the record unless you give him 50% of the publishing. I said, what? He said, you heard me. The record does not go on the air until you give him 50% of the publishing. I said, now, Harry, you tell me, do I have a choice? He goes, didn't even say no, just shook his head.
Which record was that?
At the Hop. Wouldn't put the record on the air until I gave him 50% of the publishing. But I have to love the guy. You know, it's a bittersweet situation with me. Because without him, and without me saying, go, there'd have been no At the Hop, no Danny and the Juniors. From the inside, I was right in there. I was right part of the whole scene. And I saw this whole crummy situation develop with everybody with their hands out and grab, 50% of publishing, writers' fees, and this and that, and artists getting screwed.
When you say bandstand, as everyone knows, it began in 1952. Everyone knows that it was a radio show that really prompted bandstand to be bandstand. On radio was the 950 Club with Joe Grady and Ed Hurst. Roger Clip at that time, Channel 6 at 46th and Market, was also involved with radio. It was Triangle, which was Walter Annenberg, which was AM and FM. It was Roger Clip's idea to take what they did on WPN, the 950 Club, and try and put it together on television.
Joe and I were offered that show before anybody. We got a call from Roger Clip, and he said, can you and Grady be in my office in the Widener building downtown Monday morning at 8:45? I said, of course, sir. I will see you then. It was the shortest interview we've ever had. Roger Clip says to us, you do a simulcast, you start in 2 weeks, let me know what your salary demands are, meeting adjourned. And I see Grady with a glum face. I said, what's the matter with you? Did you just hear? He says, you don't think WPEN is going to let us out of that contract to go on FIL, radio and TV? And being young and naive as I was, I said, oh, they wouldn't want to stand in the way of our success. He says, I'll tell you what, you go in and tell the station manager that we want to leave in 2 weeks. I said, okay, I'll be happy to. I go in and I said to the station manager, we have a great offer from FIL Radio and TV. We start in 2 weeks, so we'd like to leave when we know that you'll let us out of the contract. And the station manager says, well, we'll let you know. Little did we know, but that night, Bill Silk, who was the owner of Sunray Drug and head of the radio station, calls Walter Annenberg and says to Walter Annenberg, if you raid our talent, we will take $1 million in advertising and give it to the Evening Bulletin. And I'll never forget, we get a call from the assistant program director. I shall never forget these words. We find that this is not the propitious time to bring you boys over. We'll have to start our own. And that was it. That was the start of Bandstand.
Clip saw that there was something happening with music. He tried to get Ed Hurst and Joe Grady, but they were under contract. So he went to Bob Horn. Bob Horn had been one of the top-rated disc jockeys, not only in Philadelphia, but amongst the top 3 disc jockeys in the country. They paired Lee Stewart, Muntz TV, and Bob Horn. Thus Bandstand in 1952. Cheap show to do, studio, bring kids in to dance, clicked automatically. Became the biggest show in Philadelphia. Lee Stewart was not really adaptable to TV, so management decided to take Lee Stewart off, and it became Bob Horn's Bandstand.
It was just an unbelievable success. So much so that it went to the top of the ratings and stayed there. The people from West Catholic, which is located maybe 4 blocks away, they used to come in droves, but the priests didn't want them to be in uniform. So they brought a change of clothes.
They would come in from school in their little outfits and change clothes in my dressing room downstairs. That was the beehive hairdo. By the time they finished, there was nothing but hairspray all over the place. And they said, Sally, do you have any lipstick that has pink in it? I said, of course. Help yourself.
To see this wonderful generation of young people dancing, dressed in their finest, of course had a grand appeal. But the main attraction of Bandstand in those days, the Bob Horn era of Bandstand, I, to this day, firmly believe it was the director and the crew. They knew what to do, where to be, what camera to focus, where, and they were good. They were the greatest.
The public perception of Bob Horn had to be what I saw. When the show was over, he was the same. You didn't know when the lights went off if it was a different person. No, he was the same person. He'd smoke a cigar on the way out of the studio. He'd go down and have a drink at the Little Brown Jug, which was right next door to where the kids would go in the Pop Singers malt shop. And then there was something called the Brown Jug. He would go in there and have a couple beers and be talking to all the kids, patting them on the back. He was just down to earth, the same way he was on the air, he was in person.
When you start talking about Bob Horn's personality, he didn't have much. On the air, he had a definite personality, but the crew didn't like him. I'd pass him in the hall every day on Channel 6, but you know, he never spoke to me. I don't think I was ever introduced to him.
I would be in Bob's office, and he would give me records. He said, we're going to play today, rate the record. I want you to listen to these records. Pick me out 3 records out of a stack of these records. And I would pick the records. I would pick the black music that I used to love dancing to, okay? And Bob Horn, by the way, was the first white disc jockey on television to feature the original artist with the original songs. I'll give you an example. Shaboom was the big hit by the Crew Cuts. The Chords had the original version. Bob Horn played the chords. Earth Angel was a big hit by the Penguins. Gloria Mann had it. Bob Horn played both versions because I said to Bob, this is the hipper version.
Bandstand was really the center of the music business on the East Coast. Everybody stopped there. All of the stars of the time, the recording artists of the time, made it a stop.
The first time that we were in the bandstand was with Bob Horn and Lee Stewart at 46th and Market. When we did that, I mean, my gosh, they went out to millions of people, and it really helped sell a lot of records, no question about it.
It was always exciting because you knew you were going to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and it was advantageous to your career. And then I would have a rapport with the kids afterwards. You sign autographs. I mean, they were like our age, so it's like singing in the schoolyard just about. You know, the people your own age, your own peers.
Now, all the music people came to Philadelphia. All of what they call the A&R men, artistry and repertoire people, all the promotion people. They made Philadelphia a must stop, because if you wanted to break a record, if you wanted a record to be successful, you had to get it on Bandstand.
Why did Dick Clark get into the business? Well, I would have gotten into the business if my father owned a radio station, I think.
Dick began as a sportscaster. Roger Clipp, Triangle Publication, one of the stations that they were affiliated with, was the station that Dick's dad was general manager.
Most people don't know, don't realize, is that Dick was a consummate businessman. He went to Syracuse University, he got a degree in business, and business happened to lead him to music, but he was a businessman, and he was really a genius at it.
Roger Clipp and Dick Clark's father were very close friends. Dick Clark's father owned a radio station in Utica, New York, and they were well known to one another, and he came along at the right time.
Getting tired to work for Daddy in a small wattage station, he asked Dad, I believe, to give him an audition, but he did have the qualifications. He realized that if I come to Philadelphia, they have a television outlet, WFIL. So I'll start with the radio and then try to work myself into television.
Roger Clipp chose him. Nobody else there chose him. Roger Clipp did. And I remember him coming in and saying, Sally, I have a young man coming in. I want you to listen to his voice. I said, what's not to like? He's a good-looking guy, he's young, and he has a terrific voice. I said, if you don't have anybody else in mind, I said, you should go with it, run with it.
So that's how Dick came to Philadelphia on WFIL. When Bob was doing TV, Bandstand, Dick was doing radio, and Dick occasionally would do live commercials on Bandstand, okay, for certain products. So Dick had been in Philadelphia when Bandstand was at its heyday.
We were all what they call booth announcers who worked at WFIL Radio, WFIL FM, and WFIL TV. A live announcer was on call from 5 o'clock in the morning, sign on time for Channel 6, until they signed over 2 o'clock the next morning.
The first time I remember seeing Dick Clark, I was on the Bandstand show with Bob Horn. I had been on it quite a few times, you know. And I remember vividly, he would, off to the side of the main studio, was a little sort of a booth with a glass enclosure, and I would see him as I would go onto the show and wave, because he would be playing my recordings also at the time on radio.
Dick was always very friendly and polite. He was not an outgoing person, particularly. He kept to himself. He had his own office, of course, where the rest of the staff announcers and DJs shared an office. He was well respected, well liked. He was friendly and polite.
When we first met him, he was a television booth announcer. And I can remember seeing Dick at a local cocktail party, and he said to me, I'll have Bandstand. That'll be mine. You watch and see.
It had already been rumored that Roger Clipp and Six were pitching Bandstand to the network because it was the biggest rated show locally. They were interested, but they were not really interested in a guy like Bob Horn, who was too old in their eyes.
Bob Horn was doing the television show and didn't even think about Dick. Dick was over in the AM booth. Dick was the all-American boy, you know, and Bob Horn was more like an older uncle to us.
This was a very touchy time. Here was a huge show, local, but very, very popular. And Bob Horn got into some problems and got into the newspaper.
One night, Bob drives home and he gets arrested for DUI. At that time, Triangle Publications, the Inquirer, was doing a big story on that.
Bob getting busted for drunken driving when there was a campaign going on with Channel 6. Don't drive and drink. It looked bad. There was egg on the face of everybody.
The following day, Bob Horn did not do Bandstand. They put Tony Mamarella, who was his producer, in. Meanwhile, before the arrest on the DUI, he signs a brand new contract for another 3 years to be the host of Bandstand, the radio show, to be the host of Bandstand, the TV show. They take him off TV, saying, we're going to wait until the heat dies down, then we'll put you back on.
From what I understand, the person who got Bob Horn fired was Annenberg's wife, because they were doing the campaign on Channel 6 about drinking and driving. And she was the one that really said, you can't let this guy stay. Walter, you got to go down there and fire this guy.
But they said to him, your contract, we're going to pay you the same amount of money, but you're only going to do Bandstand radio. He beefed on that, hired an attorney to sue Triangle. And lo and behold, a month after the suit was initiated, Triangle, which owns the Inquirer, is doing a story about call girls and people in show business. Now you got to understand something. In Bob Horn's contract, there is a moral clause in any contract that stipulates if you are involved or any type of publicity that you're involved with, null and void the contract. All of a sudden, every day, different names are coming. Bob Horn's name is mentioned, appears in the Inquirer. Bob Horn, underage girls. He loses the lawsuit. He goes on trial for that. There are 2 trials. I was a witness on both trials. They said that he was having sex with one of the kids that danced on Bandstand. But I used to go out with her. Okay, and it wasn't so.
The papers alleged he did, but he was definitely found not guilty, and it was unfortunate because it had scarred him for life.
In the meantime, he's drinking heavily, gets involved with a second drunken driving thing, goes up a wrong-way street, hits a young kid. And that is the end of Bob Horn's career in Philadelphia.
I have to tell you something that no one ever brings out. He went out to Texas and ran into the same problem. When he left WFIL, had to leave WFIL, was fired from WFIL, a wonderful manager in Philadelphia, Nat Siegel, told me. We were driving down, he managed some of the artists in Philadelphia. He said, Bob Horn got busted out there. I said, no, I almost went off the road. I was riding on Chestnut Street. He was busted out there too? They said yes. So Bob did have a track record.
I happened to be at 46 in the Market. Dick was, at the time, a disc jockey. He was spinning records. And he said to me, come on, sit with me while while I do the show. He said, and in between records, we'll talk. And somewhere along the line, within the hour or whatever length of time he was on the air, somebody knocked on the door and stuck the head in and saying, Dick, as of tomorrow, you are taking over the Bandstand show. The whole thing with Bob Horn has exploded.
And I'll tell you another guy that they also considered, I believe, Johnny Carlton, at one time, to possibly be the replacement for Bob Horn when there was that problem in the interim when he was taken off Bandstand.
There were no auditions, there were no interviews or anything of that sort. I think the station management, the program people, and the actual management of WFIL Channel 6 knew who was on the staff, who was capable of doing the show.
Then we find out that Dick Clark is going to take over the show and Bob is never coming back. That is when I lead all of the pickets. You cannot get in the bandstand. We're picketing every one of the regulars. We're keeping all the kids out. George Kohler, who's the general manager, comes out. They have a meeting with me. Look, we know you like Bob, but Dick Clark is good. He's going to treat you the same way. I said, we want Bob Horn back. I go back outside after the meeting with these guys, and we're picketing. All of a sudden, the cops come. They lock me up, all right? They lock me up. I'm 16 years of age, okay? They lock me up. They take me to the police station. When they lock me up, the pickets go down. All of the kids that are picketing go in the bandstand.
Before you know it, after a month or so, the kids accepted Dick Clark, and the few that were picketing out front just wandered away.
You must understand something. When Bob Horn had Bandstand, every record company, every distributor would go to him with deals. Publishing, ownership, management, because at that time, there was nothing wrong with owning a piece of a record until 1959, when the Paola investigation came and the government said no more. So when Dick Clark took over Bandstand, everybody forgot Bob Horn. And all the deals that Bob had went to Dick Clark. You're on top today, you're the king, another king comes in, you inherit the kingdom. That's the way it was in those days.
Dick was television material. Dick had the qualifications, but you always need someone to get you into a major market. And I believe his qualifications did it, but a little help from his father. And I think his father was a little instrumental with the ABC affiliate when they applied to ABC Network to put the local Channel 6 show on. And lo and behold, they gave us a trial of, I think, 6 to 10 weeks in the dog part of summer, August the 5th. They said if we pull it during the summer vacation to get the kids to watch it in August, they'll watch it when they go back to school, which that's actually happened. I think we only had a 2 or 3 month contract. And by Halloween, ABC had signed a year contract, and it went to a 5-year contract. They were very happy with the show.
We used to joke about it. Bandstand was the best rehearsed program that ever hit any network anywhere. It had been on the air for, 2-3 years before it ever went on ABC. That didn't change the time or anything, didn't change the crew, didn't change the director. They had been there from the very beginning.
Dick was very instrumental in bringing Bandstand to the national audience because he was the right guy at the right time. He was very, very smart. He had the ability to not project himself, but to project the kids. And the kids were the things that really was something special, never before seen on TV.
The thing that Dick Clark copied from us is the intimacy between the regulars on the show and himself. They were really the stars of the show. What were we? We were pointers. And now, next, here is, when they went network, they were the idols. That's what helped the ratings on the show. The familiarity with the kids that danced on the show.
When it became American Bandstand with Dick Clark, of course, now it was nationally known, and it was a phenomenon then because we would get fan mail from all over the country. And I remember one instance where when we first started the first week in August of 1957, the post office at 30th and Market, which was the main post office, could not handle all the mail. They didn't have enough bags to house all the mail.
People took these youngsters to their hearts, and they had favorites, and they were getting thousands and thousands of fan letters. That's how big this was. And it was a breakthrough. It had never been done before on such a scale.
The programming was excellent, as far as I'm concerned, because every day they would have 2 different artists, and it was exciting. I mean, you were seeing recording artists that had a hit record, and then you see them on Bandstand. It's just like MTV is to the kids today. The dances, when you see them doing a stroll, you say, oh wow, man, we was, you know what I mean? It made you feel part of the show to an extent. they kind of programmed them where they all had a little story about their romances and this and that. And it's a lot of people like that, you know, not me necessarily.
Well, my father used to call it notoriety and not popularity. But it was very interesting because anywhere we went, someone would recognize who you were. Are you Joanne Monte Carlo from Bandstand? And you would stop and talk to them. So you socialized a lot. We went to a lot of dances. We always had a crowd around us. They wanted to talk about Bandstand, what it was like to be on Bandstand and a regular.
I mean, you were signing autographs like you were really a big timer, you know what I mean?
The viewers that turned during the day couldn't wait to get home to watch it. They didn't watch it for Dick Clark, they watched it for the dancers, because everybody loved to dance then. We lived for dancing.
Who made the show were the kids. I mean, Dick Clark was not the personality. He developed later, but it was the kids that made that show. In that first month, that was a trial period.
You know, there was really a bandstand. There was a wooden seating thing that they pulled out from the wall that had pyramidal seats all the way up, so that maybe 10 different rows of seats. And that's where the kids sat. There was always twice as many, maybe 3 times as many kids waiting and wanting to go on Bandstand, whoever made it that day. And there was a hysteria throughout the city.
I feel that the American Bandstand kids, as we will call them, put Dick Clark on the map because before he became the MC of Bandstand, he was not that well known. But after it went nationwide, he became the most popular icon.
Remember, from Philadelphia, it was being aired over 65 of the ABC original stations that picked up the show. So one shot on American Bandstand would give you 65 cities.
You have the power in your hand when you're the guy playing the records. So that gives you a lot of power, and it made him a giant in the industry. Quite a position to be in.
As the host of American Bandstand, Clark had power that no other disc jockey had. He was the greatest promotional venue of the 1950s and early 1960s. Nobody came close to him. And he could do with one spin of a record what it took months to do previously as far as exposure of a new record.
When I did get on, the impact was tremendous because there was such a starvation for young kids that were record buyers, a starvation for their idols. I all of a sudden became a teen idol, and that's because of the Dick Clark American Bandstand, because 5 million kids a day used to watch it.
I couldn't have done it without Bandstand because it was a dancing show. And in 2 minutes and 42 seconds on American Bandstand, when we did the twist, at that moment we changed the world. And if it wasn't for Dick Clark and American Bandstand, it wouldn't have happened.
The marketing of young, teenage, good-looking young guys like Fabian and Frankie Allen and everything was just the beginning of the sexual revolution in the music industry. It wasn't put out there with 200 kids at the parish dance, remember. This was being put on national television. And at that time, they had the ability to sell huge amounts of product to the new sexual revolution.
I'm going to try to put this in perspective for you. If any candidate for office would have an hour and a half of network television time 5 days a week, they would all be unbeatable. You're talking that kind of power. This was the biggest television show ever, with commercials, with sponsors, with product. He owned daytime television.
We had one major advantage. Guys of my ilk and era that lived in Philadelphia is that the Dick Clark show was there. And whenever somebody couldn't show up, or they would call us to do the show, so we got the benefit of that. So that helped tremendously.
If I said I need Fabian to go on the air, he would put him on. Not for any gain of his own, but just to put him on because he knows that every time Fabe or Frank did the television show, the ratings went up. His show was so important.
There were 8 million kids who watched American Bandstand every day, and it was like one big rock and roll party. And you never felt lonely when American Bandstand was on. You always felt like you had friends all over the country. And that program consolidated the whole country. and made us like one.
We were able to check out what was going on back east, even though we were in Southern California, so we tuned in quite a bit.
I think Bandstand united all of us kids into American music.
American Bandstand, they could hear that song instantly all over the country, and then you could have more of an instant success.
Now you're coast to coast, so you have a lot of power when you perform on the show. People see you every day, 5 days a week. Anything that gets you that multi-million viewing audience, it can't hurt you. That's what it's all about, to be seen. That's why we call it show business.
A starting point, a launching, as you might say, for any artist. It was very important, and everybody was clamoring to get on that show.
Every teenager in the country, I think for perhaps the only time in the history of television, or maybe in the history of mankind, was doing the same thing at the same time from coast to coast. They were watching Bandstand.
I have sworn under oath that I have never taken payola. I frankly admitted to the committee that I have, as countless other entertainers have, invested in numerous enterprises allied with the broadcasting and music industry. I've engaged in these activities very actively. I have made money from my efforts, and in many cases have not invested a great deal of money. This happens to be the nature of the entertainment business, where on small investment you can reap large returns. I have never taken payola.
So all of a sudden, these few 5 or 6 people that owned the record companies in Philadelphia had a tremendous platform. They had American Bandstand in their backyard. Most of them had known Dick Clark for years before because he had been on radio locally in Philadelphia. He had Bandstand locally before it went national. So the record companies knew Dick Clark. And this was, all of a sudden, literally a gold mine, a windfall.
And of course, Clark made Parkway because he played all of those records. The Orlods, Dee Dee Sharp, all of those artists on Cameo Parkway. They were played regularly on Channel 6.
Well, Dick Clark's poignant assertion that he never took payola is probably a description of physically reaching out and taking money from someone's hand. Dick Clark's payola gratification was much more sophisticated than that. I mean, why take a $100 bill when you can have a part of the company?
Directly or indirectly, Dick Clark was involved in every independent label and every pop music related venue just about in Philadelphia. And how could it have been otherwise? If you had an independent label, more than anything else putting you over the top is Bandstand. This is the linchpin to whether you're going to succeed with these rock and roll records. So there's nobody in Philadelphia who wasn't ready, well, to quote Moss from the hearings, to bestow brotherly love.
Dick Clark learned from the Bob Horn situation that with that power base, you could do anything you want, but you had to be clever. You had to be intellectual. You had to know what you were doing.
Clark was what they call now vertically integrated in the music business. He, through a series of companies, could handle or create a record and market it from top to bottom or bottom to top. For instance, Clark had his own talent management company, and he could sign artists and manage them through this company. He had interests, either part or full interest, in several record companies. Swan Records he had a partial interest in. Hunt Records was another one of his companies, and Jamie Records. He signed the artist to his talent management company. He had record companies on which to record the records. Dick had several publishing companies to his name, and so he also had the publishing rights, which generated more money. So he had the artists, the record companies, the publishing. He also owned a record pressing plant, so he could actually manufacture his own records.
He used to say to the artists, it doesn't make any difference who presses your records, does it? And they said, no. He says, okay, give it to me.
So he never took a $100 bill from someone. No one from the company ever laid an envelope on his desk. He got his in huge lump sums.
Other record companies, unrelated to Clark's own companies, had to have their records pressed somewhere because they didn't have their own pressing plant. And it happened on several occasions where record companies said, gee, I gotta have, 500,000 records pressed up. I might as well have them pressed up with Dick Clark's company because it can't hurt, in the long run. So he also drew business in, on a secondary basis that was even unrelated to Bandstand because people were looking to curry favor. Dick received numerous publishing rights to songs. People that owned the rights to songs came to him and just gave him the rights to a record, to the publishing rights, in hopes that he would play the record.
At the Hop was originally wrote by one of our members, David White, and the song was originally called Do the Bop.
Our management at the time, Artie Singer, he took it to Dick Clark.
And Dick said, the bop is a dance. We get dances every 2 weeks, and by the time you get this record out, the bop will be gone.
Dick told him, hey, look, I think the bop's about had it. They've been bopping around on Bandstand for the last 3 or 4 months. I think you're a little late with that stuff.
Why don't you change the title and make it At the Hop? Because record hops are now coming into their own.
He said, but guess what? All the disc jockeys are running these record hops, getting $1 a head and putting 1,000 kids in each of the record hops. So if you change that lyric and title a little bit, maybe call it At the Hop, we might be able to get yourself a hit record.
Bear in mind, I loved the guy, okay, because we were very close friends. But his business tactics sucked.
With Dick changing the title, he maintained some of the publishing, on the song.
Harry Rosen was my distributor, and Harry was handling my record. Harry Rosen comes up to my studio. I was in the Schubert building at the time. He said, Artie, you're not going to believe this. Dick won't play the record unless you give him 50% of the publishing. Wouldn't put the record on the air until I gave him 50% of the publishing. I said, now, Harry, you tell me, do I have a choice? He goes, didn't even say no.
I really didn't know too much about the inner workings of the business at that time. Later on it changed and people got favors for plays, but in our case, Dick actually did change the title, and there already were 3 writers. So in order to compensate him for that, rather than make him a full writer, they gave him a piece of the publishing. So, he did some work for what it is he got.
Granted, I cannot say anything derogatory. I can't say anything bad because I owe my success in the record phase of it to Dick Clark.
At the Hop was #1 for 7 weeks. So that's a long time for a song. In fact, it's one of the longest for a song to stay #1.
Well, it was all due to Dick Clark and Bandstand. If he wasn't here, forget about it. It would have been a wasteland. Everybody would have went to New York, Nashville, and Los Angeles just like they do today.
Of course, Clark had something that no one else in the country had. He had the national spotlight to take his record and go on American Bandstand and say, here is a great new record out of Philadelphia that's sure to be a hit, and he could play it as many times as he wanted.
He never put his records on Raider Record. He never took that chance. It was too smart for that. He wasn't leaving it up to the kids to decide the future of that product that he had a piece of. So Raider Record was for records that he didn't have anything to do with.
He had it all from top to bottom in a setup that really no one else in the business had at the time.
You're a kid, you don't know what's going on. You're just happy to be singing and playing and performing in front of people. But there's wheeling and dealing going on between the companies and between these people that are the power structure of the business. They call it payola. You want your record play, you'd have to pay this guy, you have to pay that. I didn't know that was going on, or nor did I care.
And most disc jockeys wanted to be, they were all junior Dick Clarks. They all wanted to be where the action was. And Dick was where the action was, so the other jocks would get on a record. If it had merit or not, it got played. If Dick played it, the local jocks would follow through in Philadelphia, or as well as New York City, because everybody wants to be with a winner, and they felt if he played the record, it was a winner with the kids on Bandstand, and it was a winner across the country.
Payola was the big thing. We were involved in it too. We knew the whistle was going to blow. Somebody was going to take money and not play the records, and they were all independent labels anyway that were paying. And it really hit the fan, and we were caught up in it too.
You look at the big picture, and Dick was a businessman, and his business was music, and everything he did was a sound business decision. You can't knock his business acumen, and you have to ask yourself, if I was in business and I had this guy's position and power, you know, what would I have done?
By the latter 50s, rock and roll was here to stay, to quote Danny and the Juniors, and that was much more of a factor in the payola hearings than the quiz scandals could have ever been. At the time rock and roll started to emerge, parents were horrified. It was the devil's music. Worse than that, it was leading to integration. Teens were dancing together of different colors, and this just couldn't happen. The devil's music had to go. So it was that during the height of the quiz scandals, the word came down that payola was next.
When the payola scandal broke in 1959, of course Dick Clark was right in the middle of it, being the most influential disc jockey in the country. And one of the charges that he faced was that he was involved in a conflict of interest because he owned parts of many of the records that he played on Bandstand. As far as the payola investigations in 1959 and 1960, there has been and still is great confusion as to what investigations were going on, because there were more than one. The big investigation that everybody knows about is the federal investigation in Washington that was conducted by the House of Representatives. That was a fact-finding committee to propose legislation against payola because there was no federal law against payola at the time.
So here you have 9 middle-aged congressmen, a few various and sundry investigators, a couple of lawyers, and all of which are coming at it from the standpoint not only of you gotta be paid to play this music, but all the indicators are you must be, because after all, look at one of the questions. Well, why aren't you playing Perry Como? Why aren't you playing Frank Sinatra? Why aren't you, and on of all this. And the point that we're trying to make is that why aren't you playing the artists on the big labels, the ones that wouldn't pay you? And they thought, this is our smoking gun. But of course it's not. Why weren't they playing them? They weren't what kids wanted to hear. The first appearance on April 29th of Dick Clark, by all accounts, is a tough day for him. The representatives and the lawyers and the investigators are not letting him get away with too much. They're calling him on all this stuff. They're proving that Dick Clark is involved with close to 3 dozen companies. He's owning record labels, he's owning distribution, he's owning publishing. And somewhere in this day, though, it had to occur to them that that in and of itself isn't illegal. The problem with the payola hearings is there's no smoking gun, so if you go in thinking, well, they have to be being paid to play it, you're off base immediately. But if you understand how the business works, which they didn't, you understand that the only way you're going to get anything is to get somebody who's going to walk in and say, I paid X number of dollars for this record to be played. And by all accounts, it never worked that way. One of the issues that came up at the hearings was the practice of American Bandstand asking artists to sign back the royalty checks to Bandstand.
When a performer appeared on American Bandstand, they lip-synced. They didn't sing live, but Clark had to pay union scale to the performers. They had to be paid, otherwise they weren't allowed to go on. And what happened was money that was paid by Clark's corporation to the performers had to be signed over to him or given back to him, so that it really didn't cost Clark anything.
When we did these shows, we always had to sign a release before we performed on the show. I believe that release was to relinquish any money coming to us. So as many times as we did the bandstand show, at least in my case, I never got paid. I'm sure the other guys didn't either. So the release was to null and void the whatever the financial gratuity was for that show. So we did it just for the exposure, but we never received any payment to do that show.
If you wanted to be on his show, you would have to give up that money. Otherwise, you went nowhere. You know, you just didn't go anywhere.
We were fortunate to get paid. We got paid scale. And I think what happened with us was that because the courts were so involved with us being minors, if it happened to us, it was something that went, got passed unbeknownst, because with us, it was like every penny.
When I was on Bandstand, we didn't get paid. No, we didn't get paid.
We did a lot of free shows for them. We did the record hops free. And we did a lot of that for nothing.
I think Payola back in that day for us was more doing record hops. That was more fun for us. But they couldn't make that as a payola.
To work for those record hops, I thought that was a pretty good way to promote things.
I never signed a check back over to his corporation because I never saw any checks. I never got paid for doing the Dick Clark show.
Now, Clark has maintained over the years that this was done because the show was on a low budget, which was a fact, but the production company that did Bandstand was owned by Clark, so it was his own company. Because it was his company and the company was being reimbursed, I mean, was that a benefit to him or not, if he was the company owner?
But more to the point, something that came up in the hearings a few times is Bandstand was making $12 million a year. You're telling me that artists getting their after fees would have brought the show down? During the hearings, one of the smoking guns that the investigators and congressmen thought they had was the 16 Candles trajectory. 16 Candles is a record by the Crests, and in Philadelphia, Harry Finfer at Universal had the rights and to distribute it.
When that song came out, it didn't do anything right away. It was played on several radio stations, and it didn't catch on, and it was dead. And the owner of the record company decided to give Dick Clark the publishing rights.
I think he had a piece of, I knew he had a piece of it, but I don't know if he had it all or not. I think he had a piece of it, 16 Candles. As the other records that he would play more diligently, from what I understand.
Lo and behold, Clark started to play the record on American Bandstand, and if you're a student of pop music history, you know 16 Candles became a monster hit.
After we sung 16 Candles on Bandstand, the whole world changed. All of a sudden, we never dreamed that would ever happen because we started off singing on a street corner.
The question is, did that airplay create a hit? And more to the point, did Clark play it because he got the money? All right, and neither of those questions can be answered definitively, and this was the frustration the investigators was having.
I really think that some of the transfers were made by different people. It was Billy Arnold, there was a couple of other people too, that were, called themselves our road managers, that would go with us, for these visits, to the Dick Clark show. And they'd have the briefcase of what they would have, and I noticed it would go in but never come out. Now, after I heard about the payola, I realized what must have been in that briefcase must have been money. And I knew there must have been much more than we've ever seen, than we saw through the whole history of that era. far as we're concerned, we didn't care where the money went. We didn't care that there was money. The only thing that we really knew that we didn't get any.
There was a complicated series of arrangements between the record company owners and Dick Clark himself, who was an owner or a part owner of several of the companies. As far as I know, he didn't have any ownership in Cameo Records, but it's on the record that Bernie Lowe, who owned Cameo, paid Dick Clark $14,000 after his promotion of a record called Butterfly that was a Charlie Gracie that was a big hit in the 1950s.
Dick Clark didn't have anything to do with Cameo Parkway. Swan Records was another label, but it was a subsidiary of Cameo Parkway, you know. But that's how it started, you know. Of course, he had the big hit, the Charlie Gracie thing, put him on the map, you know, Cameo Parkway.
Dick has always maintained that he didn't ask for the money and he didn't do anything for the money, and that Bernie Lowe just gave him the money. But we had this situation where he did receive money from Cameo Records.
It was with the particular company I recorded with, and we had a disagreement about record royalty payments. Well, when I sued the company, I more or less cut my throat because I never went on Bandstand again. And that cut the lifeline to my career, because without that show, which was the heartbeat of the record industry, after 5, 6 months, a year like that, people forget who you are. I couldn't get my records played anymore. I couldn't go on the show anymore. And evidently, in my mind's eye, the network that they had across the country said, you know, we're not going to play Charlie Gracie's record anymore because they used the term today, whistleblower, or, you know, I just stood up for what I thought was mine.
Felt very sad to see that happen to him because I know he had so much talent. You know, he was in that business since he was 10 years old. It must have been really, really hard on him. And many a time I know he was almost close to, you know, breaking up and breaking down. But, you know, he didn't. But there was many times he said, if I didn't have you and my kids, you know, I don't know what I would do. I'd probably go off the deep end somewhere.
A lot of people refuse to believe that somebody as upstanding, clean-cut, and as Dick Clark was, or as his image was, would refuse to believe that he could be involved in any wrongdoing anyway. So from the start, he had a favorable public image, and that carried over tremendously. You know, he was earnest, and he went before the committee and earnestly testified, and he drew sympathy from people. He didn't appear to be a criminal or unsavory at all. Another thing that helped Dick Clark tremendously was that he had the backing of his employer, the American Broadcasting Company. You have to remember, Dick Clark and American Bandstand helped make the American Broadcasting Company. So it was in ABC's interest to make sure that Clark survived this Payola investigation. And they went to great lengths to do that.
They needed to find out exactly what he'd been doing and how he was doing it. And the first thing they said is, you're going to divest all those record labels. You're going to divest all that interest. And, you know, Dick at first balked at that. No, I'm not. And he said, well, yeah, you know, think it over. He said, can I have a day? And so Dick Clark thought it over. And at some point in that day, I think he realized that all of the interests he had would be nothing if he didn't have the engine of Bandstand to fuel it. So he agreed he was going to relinquish everything.
They let Dick Clark draw up his own payola affidavit saying that he didn't take payola. ABC had a standard affidavit for everybody else that had a loose interpretation of payola, and it was tough to sign. And Alan Freed, who also worked for ABC, he couldn't sign it. He says, no, I can't sign this because I was involved. But ABC didn't make Dick Clark sign that document. They allowed him, and him alone, to draw up his own document saying he never took payola. One of the House members on the panel quipped that when the document was a Christian Dior document because it was tailored to Dick Clark's needs. Of course, Alan Freed was convicted of payola in New York, and he lost his job, and he was fired, and he died several years later, penniless.
Wasn't even in the best interest of Congress to put a hurt on Dick Clark. They did that kind of reluctantly. Had to include him in the package, but really were not going after him. He was bigger than the hurt.
Dick Clark, who was at the top of the pyramid, said that he had no knowledge of any improprieties. Second man in command was the bandstand's producer, Tony Mammarella. Tony was with the show, I think, almost from the start when Bandstand was local in Philadelphia from 1952. So Tony really knew the ins and outs of the show as the producer. In fact, when Dick Clark first took over Bandstand in 1956, Tony taught Dick the ropes. I mean, Tony knew just how the show went, and Dick Clark didn't know anything about it. So they were the combination that made the show go.
I would say that he had a lot of power behind the scenes because, you know, as Dick became more and more famous and more powerful, he needed subordinates. So you perhaps maybe got to meet him or let him hear your record before Dick heard the record, which became like a step stool.
Tony and Dick worked in a tiny office in WFIL studios. It was like a closet. They were both jammed in there. They had one telephone that they shared in a tiny office. As things evolved after the Payola scandal, and Dick said, well, I didn't know anything about it, and the rap was pinned on Tony Mammarella. Tony, it was shown, was involved in certain things, certain Payola activities, and he resigned from the show. He was a casualty of the show. So in effect, Tony Mammarella became the fall guy at American Bandstand for Payola.
So at that point, he became the scapegoat.
He received a call from Dick, and Dick's lawyers were present with him also. And Dick said that he wanted to read a statement on air, and I will read you that statement. I recently learned that my producer, Tony Mammarella, without my knowledge, engaged in deceptive practices, and I condemn him for it. I hereby terminate our association. Well, I mean, Tony said, no way, I'm not going to be the scapegoat for you. And then Dick started crying on the phone. And he said to Tony, I love you, but I want to read that statement. Tony hung up the phone. He went into the bathroom and he threw up. And Tony was devastated.
And so it was that Dick Clark, in his statement as well as on Bandstand, basically alluded to, I've just been informed of this dark secret that Tony has, or that this individual has. I don't think he mentioned him by name on Bandstand, but nonetheless. And, his resignation has been accepted, and that was in the declaration too.
So there were several things, his image, his popularity, ABC's help behind the scenes all contributed to the fact that he came out of the Payola scandals unaffected. In 1963, Clark took American Bandstand from Philadelphia and moved it to California. The reason being, after the Payola scandal, he was forced to sell all of his music companies, and he turned around and invested a great deal of that money into television and film production. And as a result, he was one of the first people to get in on the independent TV and movie film industry. And that was in the early 60s, growing by leaps and bounds.
I said, Dick, you got to come out here. It's a place for you. You got so many ideas. And he said, no. And then he called me back. He said, I'm coming out. And if you've got any room in your house to stay for a couple of months until I get my house all done, he said, I'd love it. I said, Dick, whatever you want. He had to come out here. They all came out right after that. The record companies started coming out, the executives started coming out. It was the place to make it.
The local music industry in Philadelphia suffered tremendously. When he left, the bottom just fell out. The record companies lost their promotional venue. I mean, Bandstand wasn't around the corner, it wasn't down up the block. It was a tremendous blow to the record companies in Philadelphia.
And a lot of us felt abandoned here, that he had left Philadelphia to go out there. But bigger and better things. You have to move along in this business, or any business, when you expand. And he became a giant. For many, many years, he controlled the music industry just by being on television 5 days a week. When you have that kind of power, man, you're on coast to coast 5 days a week for 2 or 3 hours a day. You're like a small god. You can make and break people.
Dick Clark didn't go out of his way for anybody unless his hands were greased. Dick could have done so much more because he was a superstar in the music business, and he only chose to help those that he had a piece of the pie, and that's unfortunate.
A lot of young black people who had a hard time breaking into the music business, people who became very famous later on in the 60s when soul music got big, people like Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. These guys couldn't even get their foot in the door, literally, at Cameo Parkway during Bandstand's heyday. But after the show left, all of a sudden, they were free to come out of the woodwork, and they went into the studio, and they really started the whole Philadelphia soul genre that became a worldwide movement in the late 60s and early 70s. So on the one hand, Clark's leaving Philadelphia was a tremendous blow to the established music industry, but it opened the doors and paved the way for all of these the soul people to be able to get into the studios.
Philadelphia was at its consummate best when Bandstand emanated from here. It has never had the image, it has never had the power, never had the impact on the world that it had when Dick Clark was in charge. And Dick Clark was in charge of Philadelphia from the time that he took over from Bob Horn. You have William Penn, Declaration of Independence, the Liberty Bell, the whole thing. This is Dick Clark City. Were there cracks in Dick Clark? Yes, he was cracked like the Liberty Bell, but he rang. Despite the cracks, he rang, and the message was clear. Dick Clark was in charge.
I never took any money to play records. I made money other ways. Since I only got $1,500 a week to produce 7.5 hours of television from ABC, I went into the music business. I was a manager of artists, a publisher of music, a manufacturer of recordings, horizontally, vertically, every single way you can think of. I made money from that show. So I'm to here with that.
What ultimately happened?
Next question.
We gave it a scientific approach. We did something wonderful, and the equation is putting out a cigarette with both feet, coming out of the shower, wiping off your bottom with a towel to the beat of the music, and now we got dancing apart to the beat. And very soon after that came the pony. Everybody does it. Even right now, they hip hop it, they do it like this, but it's still, and the fly. If you're doing the fly, you're doing the shake, and then what about the huckleberry? All of these dances, you put them all together, you got, we're here. We did that. And as a result of that, you know, the world is still hanging out, and we did that. And anyone that's doing that is the same as Alexander saying, Watson, is that you? Because the minute he picked up that phone, every time you say hello, so every time you get on the dance floor and you're doing your thing, Chubby's there.